Alrighty. Well, I want to welcome everyone to our leasing seminar. We are so excited for you to be here. I'm Lynn McAuliffe with Grace Hill, and I'll be hosting your webinar today. And today we're going to learn about 7 insights guaranteed. I like that word, guaranteed, to improve your leasing team's performance. Here are a few reminders before we begin. This webinar will be recorded and shared with you via email. So if there's anyone that cannot attend today from your teams, they'll be able to watch it later. So it will be recorded and shared. And in order to maximize our time together, we've got everyone in listen only mode except for Donald and Joanne. We do need them to be speaking. So everyone's in listen only mode. And so if you have any questions, we really want to encourage you to ask them. Use that Q&A feature that we have in there. Chat works too, but Q&A will be able to spot the questions easier if you can do that for me. And then we'll have a little time at the end to answer questions. So we'll just keep everything quiet throughout and answer questions at the end. So yes, thank you very much, Donald. Today we're welcoming Donald Davidoff and Joanne Chapman-Reps of D2 Demand Solutions. Donald is a thought leader in the multifamily housing industry, particularly in places where technology and people meet. Perhaps best known for leading the development and implementation of LRO. I remember using that myself when I was on the operations side. That is the industry's first automated demand forecasting and price optimization system. He's equally accomplished in the areas of sales performance improvement, marketing and marketing analytics, customer experience, and business intelligence. Donald can relate to you because he has been where you are. He was a former senior VP with Archstone, as well as an executive VP with Holiday Retirement. So Donald gets it. Donald works with clients to assess their demand management and technology platforms and implement highly impactful projects. Likewise, Joanne Chapman-Reps brings many years of experience in the multifamily and single-family rental industry as well. She was the VP of National Training at Archstone, responsible for key elements of onboarding, leadership, development, and customer engagement initiatives. And she holds an MS in organizational leadership. Now let's take a look at the agenda. You know, so much of sales training is based on old, unproven ideas. Today, Donald and Joanne are going to share insights using data-driven research from rental prospects to help you know what leases apartments. And among other things, you're going to learn what characteristics to hire for, things that'll help every rental prospect, things that every rental prospect cares about. That's so important. How to better align with your prospect's buying journey. The single biggest mistake we all make, oh gosh, we need to know that so we can avoid it, and the key to effective follow-up, and you all know how important follow-up is. Follow-up leases apartments. So at this time, I'm going to turn the time over to Donald and Joanne, who will start the presentation.
Great, thank you, Lynn. I really appreciate that. So let's jump right into that first bullet point, right? What is it we should hire for? What makes for great salespeople? An interesting study done now, it's about 12 years ago. It was done by the Corporate Executive Board. They interviewed hundreds and hundreds and eventually thousands and thousands of salespeople in order to determine what the different types of salespeople were, okay? They went in initially thinking that sales is so contextual, there must be a dozen or more different ways that people sell. One of the first surprises they got was using this data in a technique called cluster analysis. They found there were only 5 types of salespeople. Okay, and I'm going to work kind of from the top left and go around counterclockwise, right? The hard worker, right? That's somebody who just, even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while. If you just work hard, very self-motivated, very persistent. The lone wolf, that's kind of the natural born salesperson, if you've heard of that technique. The problem solver, that's sort of the consultative sale. Like if you can identify the problem, you can then figure out the solution. The relationship builder, very, very focused on relationships, on keeping the relationship positive, and eventually the sale happens. And then this 5th one that they hadn't really thought of before, and they called it the challenger. I actually like to think of it as insight sales, INSIGHT. It's based on insights. It's someone who always has a bit of a different view of the world. They really do understand what their customer is going through. They love to debate, and they kind of push the customer. They're not pushy, but they challenge the customer. They make the customer think a little more about what's most important to them, why they're doing what they're doing, what a good solution really looks like, et cetera. So the other surprise was when they identified these 5, they then went and talked to the heads of sales at these people's company. They asked who the best salespeople were and also who they hired for. So when they looked at the data of who the best salespeople were, they found quite the surprise, right? What they found was the high performers, the top 15% performers, right? 39% of them were this challenger and 25 were the lone wolf. And then it drops off precipitously. Compare that to the core performance, not the bottom 15, but the core, the middle 70. And the middle 70 was pretty evenly divided. In fact, a little overrepresented on relationship builder because these heads of sales said they hired for relationship builders. And what they learned here is, the 2 that clearly perform better than anybody else are lone wolves and challengers. Now, you can't train lone wolves, right? You either get lucky hiring them or not. And even when I say lucky, I use that in air quotes because lone wolves don't always play well with others. And in our world, we really need more of a team-based environment. So clearly, we want to hire for people who can be taught how to be challengers, right? Who are a little bit opinionated. They are curious about others, et cetera. And in fact, relationship builders are the least likely to be top performers. Now, if that sounds a little odd, I'll tell you, think about it a little more closely, right? The challenge with a relationship builder is if you're always focused on the relationship, then you never really manage the stress well, right? We all know that making a big decision can be stressful, and a relationship builder keeps wanting to remove the stress. But sometimes you have to use the stress to help the prospect make a good decision. And so that's why in the end, relationship builders are least represented by top salespeople. This challenger concept or this insight-driven salesperson is clearly number 1. Okay, let's go to the second tip. Joanne?
Thanks, Donald, and hi, everybody. We're really happy to be here with you guys today. So the second tip, ABC shouldn't always be closing. So the reality is that shoppers, apartments, or for anything, now have access to information in a really different way than they did in the past. And so the old ABCs, always be closing, are not the right approach for selling to prospective residents. And that's probably for several reasons. I think we can all think about in the past when we as salespeople, had all of the information, prices, availability, information about the community, the amenities, and that sort of old school approach to sales was commonplace and somewhat even expected. You can probably also think of being sold to in that way of maybe a little bit more of that old school sales approach was sort of seems like the salesperson, all they cared about was getting the sale. So we know that's not the case anymore, right? In today's world of contemporary sales, the new ABCs, as coined by Daniel Pink, focuses on the difference of selling in today's world versus how things were in the past. And so he coined the new ABCs of selling as attunement, which is really engaging with the customer to understand where they are in their search or their buying process. Buoyancy, that's the quality of salespeople to be able to bounce back from any rejection, which, I mean, it's still sales. We get it. It happens. You guys know that better than anybody. And then clarity, right? Making sure that we're really listening and having an authentic conversation. And that's more important than ever. I mean, gone are the days of sort of this caveat emptor, which is sort of this buyer beware. And now, in fact, it's switched to kind of more of a seller beware. The reality is that our customers know oftentimes more about our product than we might, because they've done a lot of research, read a ton of reviews. And so it's really, really important to think about these new ABCs of selling and a more contemporary approach to sales. Okay, so that's number 2. Now Donald's going to talk to us about the third insight.
Yeah, Lynn said that we were going to talk about the 3 things that all prospects care about. So this analysis was actually done by a group of anthropologists. So if you ever wondered what an anthropologist does, if they don't work at a museum or they don't work as a teacher to teach new anthropologists, some of them go to work for companies like IDEO in Palo Alto, San Francisco, and they get on jobs, on consulting contracts where they follow prospects around and watch what they do, observe them like Jane Goodall watching the Silverbacks, and really observe in a way that we, without that training, wouldn't see what really matters to people. And what these anthropologists taught us is that all prospects shopping for housing care about three things. They care about the apartment home itself, right? The unit. They care about the apartment community, right? In a high rise, the building, in garden, that apartment community. And then they care about the surrounding neighborhood, right? Is the location right? Now, this might seem obvious, but I will tell you, we have observed many, many times back in our years on your side of the table, and now the last 8 or 9 years consulting and teaching this, many salespeople focus on the first two, the home and the community, and they kind of ignore the neighborhood. Our hypothesis is sort of, well, someone's coming in, so they must already like the neighborhood, and we're going to focus on our stuff. Maybe it's also being a little too self-centered, focusing on our thing, okay? That's an opportunity for you and your leasing associates. If you're able to connect on all three, and the competition is only talking about the two, you're going to come across as more authentically interested. There's a couple other reasons that you want to make sure that your leasing associates talk about the neighborhood, right? We all know that in many places, whether it's public transport or the highway system or the roads or whatever, right, there are multiple neighborhoods that might be appropriate for a prospect. So if you can get them to choose your neighborhood, right, you may not guarantee you're going to get the lease, but you've knocked out 2/3 of the competition. The other thing is, think about what is happening when you're talking about your apartments and your community, right? Who are you talking about? You're talking about yourself, right? It's really hard. Joanne in a little bit is going to get into the journey, and she's going to talk about how people who tour are skeptical, right? When you're buying, you're skeptical. You're not sure who to believe, and nobody says I'm lousy at service, but we're cheap, so that's why you should buy from me, right? So with that skepticism, anytime you're talking about yourself, how do they know that you're telling the truth? How do they know it's really right? But if I say something like, hey, Joanne, I'd love for you to move into here at Casa de Nada, but even if you don't live here, let me tell you why Littleton is a great neighborhood, right? The parks, the walking area, the river that flows through, the closeness to the groceries, all the different grocery stores are great restaurants. If I can sell around the neighborhood, right, talk about the neighborhood, she doesn't have to buy from me to get the neighborhood, and so I'm going to come across that much more authentically. She's much more likely to believe what I say about the neighborhood than what I say about myself. So we know these are the three things that all prospects care about. We have a tendency to focus on 2 of the 3 and ignore the third, and yet the third is where we might be able to most completely, most effectively connect with the resident and be believable. The added benefit is we'll knock out 2/3 of the competition, and even if we don't win every one of them, we'll still get a greater share. So that is what's important about all prospects caring about those same 3 things. Joanne, back to you for number 4.
Thanks, Donald. So as Donald mentioned, the prospect journey is also a really important insight and something to think about. So this same group of anthropologists that Donald just mentioned also follow prospective residents around on their journey to understand sort of what they experienced. And this is what they've learned. They've learned, in fact, that there are 5 phases that a prospective resident goes through as they're shopping for a new apartment home. So they start off with imagine. So I'm going across the top here. They imagine the possibilities, where they might want to live, what that perfect apartment home might be, that 2-bedroom, 2-bath overlooking the park with the fantastic fitness center, a pool, anything is possible. Then they start to refine. They start to learn about the reality. They adjust some needs and desires. Sometimes maybe they can't exactly find that perfect, what they thought, 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment in that exact location with that amazing pool, the fitness center, and so on. Next, they examine. This is where they can do their tours, drive by. So they've obviously selected and narrowed down a bit, and this is where they start to judge, right? The 4th phase of their journey, this is where they commit. They decide on which of the apartment homes they really are going to move into. They look for reassurance, so they're trying to make sure that was the right decision, and they sign their lease. So that's the commit phase. And then the final phase from the prospective residents' eyes is that they settle in. They coordinate the logistics and, they're getting comfortable. So those are the phases. If you then look where it says prospect emotions in those orange bubbles, you can see the phases or sort of the stages of emotions as they're going through each of the 5 phases. So I'd imagine they start off super enthusiastic, as you might presume. They start to refine, they get overwhelmed, right? There's so many choices out there. They examine, and they are, guess what, skeptical. Why? Because they're talking to salespeople. They are starting to see things that they're putting a really skeptical eye to. Unfortunately, until trust is built, sometimes, a skeptical emotion is quite common, right? They don't know us. They don't know that we genuinely have the best in mind for them. They start to feel very insecure. They have to commit. Probably not surprising, right? Did I make my best choice? Do I have buyer's remorse? And then, unfortunately, they feel kind of abandoned as they move in. They've had a ton of attention paid on them as they were a prospective resident, but sometimes when they go to move in, they start to feel a bit abandoned. So I want to contrast that then with our emotions as sales teams. If you think about where our sales teams feel in this whole thing, they're kind of uncertain as the prospective resident is imagining. I mean, the reality is that they really don't know that prospect at that point. Only 1 out of every 12 initial leads turn into a lead. So that's probably pretty natural if you think about it. Our teams get really encouraged as the prospective resident starts to refine. This might be where they see the lead, the prospective resident are calling, we're starting to engage a little with them. We're super excited when they tour because guess what? We're in the leasing business. So if we're not excited when they tour, we may not be in the right business, right? So we're super excited. We are thrilled when they commit to lease. Whether we genuinely wanted to help someone, whether we're motivated by the lease, the numbers, whatever it may be, we're in this business, so we're super thrilled. And then as they start to settle in, many of us, because we're in the sales space, have moved on to the next prospective resident, and we've kind of moved on a little bit. So what's important about all of this? What we can't do is we can't change people's emotions. Those are natural, those are gonna happen. What we can, however, do is be aware of it, make sure our leasing teams are aware of it if we're leaders and we're leading leasing teams, and be very empathetic about what it is that the prospective resident is going through. One thing I'd like to especially highlight is if you look at the examine phase, right smack in the middle, you'll see on the left, skeptical in that orange color and excited in that green color. That is a very interesting sort of observation. And that is to say that at the very moment that we are meeting our prospective residents, often for the first time, we are feeling really excited. They're feeling skeptical. And so what we can do about that is we can be empathetic, we can be aware of their journey, and then we can provide reassurances to them by how we behave. Okay, now, what I'm actually going to talk about next also will sort of drive us to that empathy and being aware of our prospective residents and how they're feeling. And that is the next insight we'd like to share. And this insight is we build credibility by asking good questions. So the prospect-centered approach that Donald's going to share more about in a moment is really built on asking good questions and then actively listening to responses. So not jumping in to start selling before we truly understand what's important to the prospective resident. When you're asking questions, it is all about the prospective resident and thus truly prospect-centered. When you're talking about your community, as Donald mentioned earlier, it is more about us, right, instead of them. So instead, what we advocate is during the sales conversation, you really gain credibility by asking good questions and not giving good answers, which I know sounds super counterintuitive, I get it. But the reality of it is that asking questions and listening very carefully really does honor the prospective resident. It shows empathy to them, and it shows that you are genuinely listening to find them the best possible apartment home for them. Focusing on the prospective resident enables you to provide your full and undivided attention. And it also helps us not to jump to conclusions, but to really listen. Sometimes I feel like because we've done this so much, you know, the next prospective resident comes in the door and you're like, oh, I know exactly what you're looking for. Well, no, actually they're a completely different person. And so take the time, ask really good questions and listen. And what you will do there is you will demonstrate empathy, as we just mentioned, is so important at this point in the sales process. And it will truly differentiate the experience, frankly, from your competitors. So the tip here is build credibility by asking good questions. Donald, over to you.
Yes, and since we're speaking about questions, I will remind everybody, please ask your questions, right? The Q&A box should be at the bottom middle of your screen. There's an opportunity to ask questions, and Lynn will read them off to us at the end. We definitely want to, sort of, my old only half joke is when we're talking about what we're talking about, we're not sure if anybody cares, but when we're answering somebody's question, we know that at least one person cares. So we would love you to do that. Also, do remember when you're asking, in the sales context, when you're asking questions, right, you're not talking about yourself. As salespeople, we have a tendency to give too many answers and talk too much about ourselves. So let's see how that plays out in the model, okay, in the sales model itself. So our tip number 6, the penultimate tip, spoiler alert, we're actually going to give you a bonus tip, so there's really 8. But this tip about abandoning models that are all about us. Think very honestly about your sales model. What you've been taught, if you're a salesperson, a leasing associate listening to this, if you're a leasing manager, what have you been teaching? What does your company espouse as an approach to selling? Unfortunately, I mean, Joanne and I together have, we've probably looked at 40, 50, maybe even 100 company sales models in this industry over the past 20, 30 years. Virtually all of them look something like the graph you see here, right? They teach the leasing person about how initial leads come in and what you should do on first contact. They teach you how to tour, often making the tour the emphasis of the sale. In fact, they not only say that you should, back to the ABC, always be closing, they not only say that you should always ask for the lease at the end of the tour, but in fact, they threaten you with a shop, right? And the shopper is going to gig you if you don't ask for the lease on the tour. And then once you get a yes, sort of how to deal with that and move in. What does that approach really emphasize? It really emphasizes what the management company wants to have happen, right? How does the management company want you to handle first contact? How does the management company want a tour? What is the result that the management company wants from the tour, and how to handle the process of moving in? It's very, very process-centered. It's understandable, it's natural to think this way, but it's not really prospect-centered. It's very management company desire-centered. So if your sales process looks like this, you might want to consider, how can you make it look more like what I'm showing you here, where we truly put the prospect at the center. We actually look at what is the prospect journey, right? Taking all those things Joanne showed you earlier, how does the prospect go about their search, right? What do they do and how do we line up with that? There is an initial discovery, right? Now, one of the interesting things now in contemporary times is most of a prospect's discovery happens online, right? I don't know if you've ever heard of Google's 0 moment of truth. They did a seminal study back in the late aughts. Just Google moment of truth or 0 moment of truth, and you'll find the study. It's a great read. But because of that 0 moment of truth, because prospects can do all this research on their own before they come to us, our discovery has now turned into more of how do we catch up to the prospect very quickly, okay? Once the prospect has done some initial discovery, they're doing some inquiry, and that's a place where we can practice inquiry, okay? That's where we're gonna ask a bunch of these really good questions that Joanne just talked about. Then they're ready for advocacy, right? They're not ready for advocacy until they've gone through these other 2 phases. And then once they make a decision, they're ready for implementation. So we line up with their discovery, we have to catch up with them. There's that phase of inquiry that we can really dive deeply in to understand them. And then they're ready for advocacy, and off we go. One of the key things about this kind of model is it's got a principle that you do not enter the next phase until you've met the exit criteria of the prior phase. And so we promised up at the beginning, Lynn talked to you about what's the most common mistake that salespeople make, that leasing associates make? It's violating that rule. And it's particularly violating that rule in the inquiry phase, okay? So prospects done their discovery. They've come to either talk to you on the phone, or maybe it's a FaceTime or some other virtual tour, or more and more these days, we're back to physical tours. They're in the office meeting with you. You've quickly caught up to where they are in their process, and now it's time to ask some good questions. But the frequent mistake that we make is violating that rule. We don't want to enter advocacy until we have fulfilled the exit criteria for inquiry. So what does that look like? I asked Joanne, I noticed, let's say she and her husband come in, and I asked them what's most important to them as they look for a new home. And she happens to have a young kid, so she starts telling me about her kid. Now, the schools are really, really important. And I go, ding, 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 we have great elementary schools. And so I start telling her about the great elementary schools. And then I ask her another question, and she says something, oh, ding, 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 and I start to talk about what we do for that. And then maybe I ask a question and she answers it in a way I don't have a good answer. So I kind of go to the next question, hope she doesn't notice that. Even if consciously she doesn't notice it, subconsciously what's happening? She's recognizing that every time I ask a question, it's all about me. It's all about getting an answer so I can say something, right? Even subconsciously, she may notice I don't always say something about me. If there's not a good question, I seem to shuffle on. So that moving back and forth between inquiry and advocacy violates the principle of not entering advocacy until you finish inquiry, right? It's what we call the ask, answer, respond mode. I ask a question, she answers, I respond. I ask another question, she answers, I respond. Much, much better to have the ask, answer, listen mode. Ask a question, listen. Ask a question, listen. Ask a question, get the answer, listen. Do that 6, 8, 10, 12 times even. And what kind of, what's the nonverbal that I'm communicating, right? I'm not talking about me. Every answer isn't about me. I'm spending time to get to deeply understand this person. And I mean, this time is maybe 10 minutes. It's not that long, but I can get 6, 7, 8 questions and answers in a 10 to 15 minute period and really understand what the prospect cares about, what they need. And as a result, I don't start advocating until I'm done with that. And just think for a moment what that does psychologically in the prospect's mind, okay? Now, I will say probably the second most frequent mistake, it's in this ask, answer, respond mode, is using the tour as a means of asking questions. We have worked with clients who literally say, oh, I use the tour to uncover what they need. But think about that for a moment. What is the tour? The tour is like the ultimate act of advocacy, right? I'm showing off who we are, what's great about us. And so if you believe, if you embrace everything we're just talking about here, right? I don't want to get to advocacy till I'm done with inquiry. I should be using the tour after I'm done with inquiry. In fact, I should finish my inquiry, really understand what Joanne cares about, and tailor my tour, right? Yes, there's fair housing, but fair housing doesn't mean I have to use the same tour path for everybody, right? If Joanne clearly told me she doesn't care about the gym, there's no reason for me to show her the gym, okay? Or vice versa. She has told me how important that is, then I want to highlight that in the tour. Maybe I want to make it the first or the last thing, because people remember first and last more than the middle, right? So I'm going to use the tour as my principal advocacy activity after I've done inquiry. That's certainly what we advocate, okay? Coming in towards the home stretch, a little bit more to go before we get to the Q&A. I'm going to turn it back over to Joanne to talk about number 7. This is what Lynn told us in the agenda is all about the right way versus the wrong way of follow-up. Joanne?
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So insight number 7, don't just continue the conversation, advance it. So this sort of activity might be called follow-up for you, but we want to share a slightly different approach that is different and more effective. So sometimes when we ask for the lease, the prospective resident is not ready to commit to sign right then, and we've not secured it. What we need to do then is advance the sales process. So I want you to think about that as different than traditional like follow-up, where you're just sort of doing an activity but without motion in it. Advance, get it? So when I say the word advance, just think about for a moment what that means, right? Advancing the process is different than just continuing the conversation. Advancing instead means that we get agreement on a specific set of things that the prospective resident and or that we will do, and we agree to a specific time or action when we will next talk. So, for example, if a prospective resident tells us that they need to visit another couple of competitors before deciding, instead of just saying, oh, okay, well, is it okay if I call you on Thursday? Versus, yeah, I'll just call you, versus, is it okay if I call you on Thursday? I'd love to hear what the advantages and disadvantages are and what time works for you for us to talk, right? So can you see how that's just a little bit different than, oh, I'm just doing follow-ups and I just picked Wednesday morning for all of my follow-ups, and sometimes people answer the phone, probably most often that they don't. So the difference there is advancing requires you and the prospective resident agree to an activity and commit to it. It means we are making progress, forward action, not just sort of kicking the can down the road. And oftentimes we say here that we're assigning homework for the prospective resident and for ourselves. So assigning homework, again, is kind of getting commitment from them. So let's have a look at what this might sound like more specifically. So on the left-hand side, this is just sort of this follow-up, right? Prospect says, this is my first tour, so I want to see some others. And we say, is there anything about this home that doesn't meet your needs? No, I just promised I'd look at other options. Oh, okay, I can understand that. Would it be okay for me to call and follow up in a few days? That's kind of what I think several of us might do, just not realizing what the difference might be here to advance. So on the right-hand side, here's kind of what an advance could sound like. So the prospect says, well, this is my first tour, so I still want to see some other options. And agent still, you know, is there anything about this home that doesn't meet your needs? No, but I promised I'd look at other options. So the difference is, sure, I can understand that. When do you expect to be done with those tours? Prospect says day after tomorrow. Okay, I always like to learn about my competition, especially through my customer's eyes. When I call to follow up, whether or not you decide to lease here, would you be willing to share your observations? So this is an example of an advance and an example of giving the prospective resident some actual homework for them to do, right? The idea here is that we're setting a task that each of you are going to accomplish. It's time bound and it moves toward a decision. It's not pushy, but it is active and confident. Okay, so that's what we mean by advancing the conversation, which is really different than just traditional sort of follow-up where we don't always get forward motion. All right, so I realize this webinar was called the 7 Insights Guaranteed to Improve Your Leasing Team's Performance. However, guess what? Donald's now going to share a bonus insight number 8.
Before that, in the chat box, does anybody recognize what that picture is on the left-hand side? Right, Joanne and I are both old enough to remember as kids watching that guy on television on a show called Dialing for Dollars, where he would call people to award money if they answered. But we used to, Joanne and I, not so affectionately referred to the practice of, oh, Tuesday morning is my time to go through all my guest cards and do all my follow-up. Referred to that as dialing for dollars, right? Very passive, just calling people and hoping they made a decision, as opposed to the very active one. So I'm just curious, there's probably a lot of people on this call who are young enough that they look at that graphic and wonder what the heck that is. That's the story.
Yeah, we got to vote for Carson.
Yeah, you don't want to be dialing for dollars. You want to be targeted, have a reason. You want to have a reason to call somebody, right? If your only reason to call is to check in, you're not really advancing the conversation. You're just hoping. You'll get some business, right? Even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while. But if you advance it, if you have a reason to call, if there's homework you owe them or homework they owe you, it's going to be much more confident, much more effective. Okay, let's talk about number 8. So bonus tip number 8 is be yourself and have fun. Okay, authenticity was one of the new ABCs. Authenticity shines through, right? Ask most salespeople what they like least about sales, even the good ones, and they will often tell you they don't feel like they get to be themselves. That's terrible, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't want to work in a profession where 8+ hours a day I've got to pretend to be somebody I'm not. I'd much rather be myself and succeed on my own talents, my own skills. And the reality is, I don't know if you ever had to pretend to be somebody else. You certainly don't have to today, right? As Joanne talked about earlier, they're not coming to us for information that they can't get elsewhere. And so the relationship that we build by adding value, again, not the relationship builder who tries to create value by just being nice, but the relationship builder that the challenger or the insight person creates by providing value, by asking good questions that help the prospect figure out what's most important, by giving answers when it's appropriate once they're ready for advocacy. If you're just yourself, that authenticity shines through. And frankly, as I said, life's just too short to work in a job you don't enjoy, but more importantly, it leads to results. So this chart here is several years old, but the results, the effectiveness hasn't changed. This was one of our earlier clients where we were doing, we did a whole sales performance improvement program around the concepts we've shown so far, plus even a few more. It was a full day's worth of training. And you can see they were tracking their occupancy versus market. So if you go to this top line, if you can see my cursor, their occupancy was not only tanking, but it was way below the market, okay? This blue box was where the training occurred, where the additional coaching got implemented. And you can see how quickly their occupancy shot up when the market didn't really get any better. So the results were really powerful. Now, we were fairly new to doing this, and we had actually warned the COO, you might need to prepare for a little more turnover because we're asking people to do things differently than they did before. So we had them all prepped that maybe have a little more turnover, but be good turnover, okay? I remember a few months later, I was actually if anybody went to the last NAA conference that was in San Francisco, right? That was back in 2016. I remember getting a call from him then and going, hey, oh, good to hear from you. How things going? He said, remember when you told me that we were going to have lower turnover, or we were going to have more turnover because of implementing this? Well, take a look, right? The program was implemented in the middle of 15, and then you can see by 16 what had happened. Their turnover actually went down, right? So what we learned from this was a couple things, right? Not only was it more effective, but by telling and teaching the leasing agents that they didn't have to pretend to be somebody else, that they weren't expected to play games, okay? That they could be their authentic self, find their own voice. There were principles that are really important, but there were no scripts. No scripts to memorize, just principles to follow. Be yourself, be naturally curious, naturally caring. It actually made the job more enjoyable, plus who doesn't like being more successful? So between the job being a little more enjoyable on its own and the success in a positive feedback loop, it actually resulted, and this is the Gene B. Glick Company. They did allow us to share that, so you see the source. This is what the Gene B. Glick Company learned was they actually got better results and higher retention because people enjoyed their jobs more using this kind of model, this kind of approach. Okay, we're getting near the end. Let's just do a brief recap, and then we'll get into Q&A. So Joanne, I'll let you do the recap.
Perfect. Okay, so in summary, what we have talked about in each of our tips, the best salespeople are challengers, not relationship builders. Donald talked to us about that. I shared the new ABCs and that they should no longer always be closing. We talked about that prospective residents care about the same three things, the home, the apartment home, right? The community, as well as the neighborhood. And often though, in fact, instead of the way that we may think of it, they in fact think of it completely the opposite. They start off with the neighborhood, right? And then they narrow their focus from there. I shared the prospective residents' emotional journey, as well as contrasted that with our team and what we should know about that. We know then as well that we should build credibility by asking really good questions, definitely key to contemporary sales. Donald talked about the difference in models, in sales approaches, and how we really should think about abandoning models that are all about us, because it's not really about the prospective residents. And then I shared with you this new way of follow-up, but it's not follow-up, right? It's advancing the conversation. And then Donald just shared with us, bonus number 8, be yourself and have fun, and the results definitely will follow. So that's what we did today over our
Excellent.
Lunch and Learn. Easy peasy.
So one little commercial at the end. You don't get free webinars for nothing. If you liked what you heard, if you think that your leasing associates would benefit from this, just yesterday, Grace Hill announced in a partnership with us at D2 Demand that we have a multi-course program, Sales Performance Improvement and Coaching, that is a new elective course series now. So if this is at all interesting to you, there's, we covered these 8 tips. There's a dozen more, in a full, online series that is the equivalent of a day's worth of in-person training. So there's a lot more even beyond what we talked about here. We'd love for you to try that out. All you need to do is talk to your Grace Hill account manager, and they have information on this. They can get you signed up. It's very, very affordable. And again, we're proud of the results that we've seen when we've done in-person training with this, to be able to partner with Grace Hill and make it easily available online, especially as everybody's gone more virtual and everybody's so busy, to be able to do this in a self-paced mode. Please, any interest at all, get a hold of your account manager. Any other questions, don't hesitate to talk to your account manager or shoot an email to Joanne or me. You can find the D2 Demand website. So with that, I think, Lynn, in the last 15 minutes, we're ready for Q&A. Anybody have any questions? Please go ahead and use the Q&A box to make your questions available to us. You can also use the chat box, but it's a little easier for Lynn to manage in the Q&A box. So, Lynn, do we have
I do. Donald, I've got several questions about questions.
Okay.
So what are some examples of great questions to ask prospects? Because you mentioned that's important.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Question about questions. So I would say, a couple things. The first thing is it's very contextual, right? Questions that you might ask in discovery as you're first meeting somebody, those are really just icebreakers. There's no such thing as an opening question that is a shibboleth to, to get the deal, right? So you want to, humans just naturally need to sort of ease into a conversation, especially with a stranger. So pretty simple questions up front. What brings you here is a great open-ended question. That's another point. Open-ended questions help expand the conversation. Closed-ended questions help us narrow it down. It's not that open-ended questions are great and closed-ended questions are bad. It's contextual while you're in the conversation, or if you're dealing with decision reluctance, which we did not cover today, but is in the series I mentioned that Grace Hill has. There may be points where you want to expand the playing field, so you ask a very open-ended question. There may be times when you want to narrow the playing field, so you ask a multiple choice or yes/no question intentionally. What I would say, just a couple examples of some good open-ended questions. I mentioned early on, just what brings you here, right? I like to ask questions that try to get more to the emotion. So I don't want to just ask, what are you looking for in a new home? That's a little bit factual. I like to ask questions like, what did you love about your past home, right? And you wouldn't want to lose in a new home. What are some things maybe you didn't like about your past home that you'd love to have something better in your new home, right? That gets a little more emotional. And then sometimes you can ask kind of an off-center question that can really get the prospect to think, demonstrate how knowledgeable you are, how much you care about their success. A really good example of that is we were working with a company. They had a leasing agent in Southern California who told us that he always asked his prospects whether they wanted morning or afternoon sun. Right? Would you like morning or afternoon sun? That is not a question most agents ask. So right away, he was differentiating. And it's a really thoughtful question, like, oh, no, I wake up in the morning, have my cup of coffee, I really want the sun shining in the door, right? Or, oh, I leave work so early, it's usually still dark. When I come home, I want that bright sun coming in. So I'm not saying that's the perfect question for every property, obviously. I wouldn't ask that in Seattle in the rainy season, but for Southern California, it was perfect. So anything that really helps the prospect make a better decision, now you're always helping as opposed to always closing. Joanne, any other great questions on your mind?
I do see.
Well,
I'm sorry, Joanne. I do see another one. But Joanne, you want to go ahead or?
Well, I was actually going to point out, I think the same. I think we were going to say the same thing. There is a question about in the chat about knowing that the prospective resident is already interested in the neighborhood. What's a good way to talk about the neighborhood, Donald? And so I guess to answer that one, you know, I think one of the most important things about talking about the neighborhood first is knowing about the neighborhood. So I guess I'll say first things first is making sure that you are thinking about the neighborhood through the lens of a prospective resident, right? So oftentimes we don't live where we work, and we may know just what's outside of the community, but sort of really immerse yourself in it and think about it through that lens. And then I would say from there, I would, you know, understand what it is that the prospective resident likes about the neighborhood. And then when it does come time for sales presentation, because you have the knowledge already, since you've done that research, then you can sprinkle those points through as you are in this advocacy phase and saying the kinds of things, you know, and here's why I know you're really going to like it here. You mentioned earlier that you like to go out in the evening and have a meal. We have wonderful small privately owned restaurants, or there's a great Italian, whatever it is, right? That really is customized to what you heard from them during inquiry. So that's my answer to that one. Donald, what would you add?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I just want to build on what you said. I think that question, the answer to that question really ties into the answer I gave on the first question, right? Is if you ask good questions in inquiry, right? Really get to what they want and don't want, not just in their home, not just in their community, right? But overall lifestyle, right? Ask some lifestyle questions, those emotive questions. Those answers will help you then highlight, just the way Joanne said, right? They'll help you highlight what's cool about the neighborhood, and you can really sell the neighborhood first and your community second, because you know you're connecting better with the first and the second. But Joanne's first point is really clear. We get amazed at how many leasing agents who don't live where they work, who don't even know what the trail system is, or what the restaurants are, where the grocery store is, or the church is, et cetera. So it's a really good exercise for everybody to drive around the neighborhood and get familiar with it, so that you can then leverage the great questions to tie to you know, things that will really attract the prospect to your neighborhood. What do we have next, Lynn?
Okay, this is a big one. You know, they're saying that, you know, a prospect calls or they walk in, first thing they ask, how much is it? So the question we have is, how do we handle discussing price?
Yeah, I got a really pretty simple and short answer to that, is just, you know, just talk about price. Just, you know, bring up the rent. I mean, you know, in the old days, you know, old sales systems, they would emphasize, like, you need to build value before you talk about price, because if you talk about price first, then all they do is every single thing they go, is it worth it? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? That may have been true back when price was opaque, but let's be honest, what percentage of residents, or excuse me, what percentage of prospects come through the door today where they don't already know what the rent is, or at least have some idea, right? If they looked you up online, with the price transparency that's out there on the ILS, on your own website, price and when to bring up price and how to talk about price used to be a big deal. We just fundamentally don't think it's a big deal anymore. They probably already know it. So back to be authentic, you know, just talk about what it is. It's good to be really familiar with what you've got available, right? So somebody's a little more price sensitive, you'll aim them toward a lower amenity home, right? Somebody who's got a little, you know, a little more, little broader, deeper needs, you know, maybe a more amenitized home will help. So you can kind of use the difference in prices to establish the differences in value between the choice. But as far as like making some super psychological approach to when and how to talk about price, and they've already been online, they know what the price is.
Okay, great. I've got one more. Some of what you discussed sounds a bit different in skill set than maybe we're typically focused on when we're trying to hire leasing consultants. How do we use this information to recruit and hire? And even a braver question, how do we compensate leasing agents? Do we need to compensate them any differently now that we're asking them to learn more customer-centered skills and that kind of thing?
Joanne, you want to start with the recruiting side?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think great question there. I think that from the recruiting side, sort of this intellectual curiosity and this sort of ability to ask really good questions and to be genuinely interested in people is a great skill. that that we know is true for this. Donald mentioned earlier this idea of a challenger, right, as opposed to sort of the more if they like me, they will lease from me. But like the reality of it is that you know, what we do here is we don't provide a script. We don't like the idea of telling, you know, teams what they say, but instead provide this framework. And so genuinely liking to talk with people, ask really good questions, and listen to authentically hear what it is that they need and want, and then find the best apartment home for them. That's really kind of some of the skills that are important. I will say that there are some of us who have been in the industry for a while, and, you know, kind of learning a new trick is part of what some of the existing teams need to do, you know, to be successful in this new way of sales. But as far as, you know, selling in this approach goes, like Donald mentioned, it really is about, you know, asking good questions and listening and wanting to engage with prospective residents.
And I'll speak a little on the compensation side. I mean, I still think that you know, sales is sales, and salespeople want to be bonused for their success. So I think, you know, to Joanne's point, you are looking for particular characteristics in the recruiting phase now. You really want people who are truly curious about their prospects, who enjoy those conversations, who are comfortable asking a number of questions before they talk about themselves, right? But on the compensation side, I don't think the system necessarily changes the compensation system so much as it equips your leasing agents with tools to be successful in whatever your compensation system is. So that would be how I would approach that.
Okay, great. That's all the questions we have.
Okay, well, I just, again, I want to thank everybody for participating. Hopefully you got something out of it. And again, I'll just remind you, if you think this would be great for your company to leverage, there's a whole, you know, multi-phase course online with your Grace Hill LMS. Just talk to your account manager and they will be happy to help explain how that works and make it happen for you. Thanks, everyone.